Good morning to all, and congratulations to the Heritage and Education Network Belize for organizing this stimulating symposium. Thanks for having me. When we talk about Belize's cultural heritage, we seldom think about our political culture. That is the historically based and widely held beliefs, feelings, and values about the nature of our political system and our political relations as a state. I think that most will agree that Belizeans generally value free elections, peaceful changes of government, open political expression, political tolerance, and equal political treatment of all ethnic groups. On the negative side, some would say that our political culture also includes a tendency for short-term or panacea political solutions, mistrust of politicians, and widespread political clientelism. But my paper today zeroes in on Belize's political culture as it relates to race and multi-ethnicity. On the surface, Belize's multi-ethnic demography has hypothetically represented a potent brew for the development of ethnic-based parties in the nationalist and post-independence politics of Belize. We know that since the 1950s, there have been 6 ethnic groups with more than 3% of the population, and that since independence, the proportion of the largest 2 groups, the Creole and the Mestizo, seen at the top there, has experienced major demographic shifts. Yet, Belize has been quite unique in avoiding ethnic-based party politics in comparison to Caribbean states such as Guyana, Suriname, and Trinidad and Tobago. The record does show that neither the PUP nor the UDP, or the UDP's predecessor, the NIP, neither has proactively sought political identification based on ethnic issues and allegiances, and both parties have generally received relatively balanced support from all ethnic groups over time. Because almost every geographic constituency has a majority of one ethnic group, it is easy to demonstrate that both political parties have won almost every constituency over time. In short, a pattern of political parties appealing for votes from all ethnic groupings and alternating who win seats in the same constituencies in different elections has generally prevailed. These electoral maps showing the red and the blue dominating across the country over elections since 1984 to current illustrate, I think, the point very well. For one political party to overtly appeal to or to favor one or other ethnic group is to flirt in the Belizean context with political suicide. So how has Belize managed to avoid ethnic-based party politics? To answer this question about our political culture, we must examine key historical aspects of the interaction between ethnicity and politics. First, the tensions as Belize and its political parties evolved before independence. And second, those tensions just after independence as Belize's ethnic demography changed rapidly. There were indeed potential opportunities for ethnic-based parties to spring up in Belize in the 1950s and 60s as the new nationalist leaders jostled for political power and formed political parties. Although not as overt as between Afro and India groups, say in Guyana, Belize has also had a pre-nationalist history of tensions among some of its ethnic groups, due in part, of course, to the divide and rule tactics of our colonial masters, the British. However, it was the potential for ethnic and racial tensions between the Creole and the Mestizo that is of key interest here. The Creoles made up just over 50%, as we know, of the population between the 1950s and 70s, and was a majority in the then capital, Belize City. It was from the ranks of the Creole and the Creole elite, to be more precise, in Belize City, that most of the original nationalist leaders emerged. This was the case, for example, for John Smith and Lee Richardson, the first and second leaders of the PUP. And it was also the case for Philip Golson. And all these three, of course, we know, split with George Price and the PUP in 1956. Golson, who became leader of the NIP, we see him on the right here, in 1961, could be described as an Afro-Creole. George Price, the leader of the PUP from 1956 to 1996, and Belize's father of the nation, may best be described as a mestizo Creole. By the end of the 1960s, when the original PUP leadership had split and the NIP had formed, a narrative was bubbling of the PUP being more Latino-oriented and the NIP being more Creole-oriented. Importantly, Price, from a very early point in time, had espoused a clear Central American and continental destiny for Belize and opposed the West Indian Federation. Price argued that the Federation could lead to Belize being swamped by poor Caribbean immigrants. On the other hand, Smith, Richardson, and Golson eventually changed their positions to become firmly in favor of federation, and they began to openly attack Price's Central American vision. They also joined the then anti-PUP British in accusing Price of being too friendly towards Guatemala. Looking back, the decade between the PUP split in 1956 and the first post-self-government election in 1965 could easily have been one or more, or we could very easily have seen one or more of the nationalist leaders appealing to race or ethnicity in pursuit of political advantage. Indeed, as Godfrey Smith wrote in his excellent biography of Price, quote, "The issue of race bubbled to the surface," unquote, after 1956, as Richardson and Golson introduced race into their political dispute with Price. They contended, for example, that, quote, "certain people felt that the logical leaders ought to be the Latins among us," unquote, and they were not comfortable with Creole leadership. That is the Richardson, Golson, and Smith accusing Price of this. They suggested that Latinos were planning to uproot the Creole leadership. At the same time, Price doubled down on his vision for a Latin American economic destiny for Belize. Not surprisingly, the British colonial authorities preferred the less militant NIP at the time and sought actively to destabilize the PUP and discredit Price. In this context, the British's devious and divisive tactics could have helped to trigger overt racial and ethnic party politics, were it not for more powerful mitigating factors. The first mitigating factor was that of race, was that of class. For a while, the NIP had taken almost all the original elite Creole leaders from the PUP was able to attract others while maintaining the support of the masses of the working class Creole, who had been, as we know, the labor backbone of the fading forestry industry. The second is that the geographical clustering in separate spaces by Belize's ethnic groups limited, did not eliminate, but limited intense competition with each other for resources and power, a point often made by the Caribbeanists Ralph Premdas. Third, by the time of the 1956 split, the PUP and Price successfully built a truly national party on the very broad back of the national labor movement. As such, all other ethnic groups were being integrated in the PUP and in national politics well before the NIP was formed in 1958. Importantly, the PUP was winning national elections and was able to dispense programmatic as well as clientelist resources and favors to supporters of all ethnic groups across the nation. Relatedly, Price deliberately began to bring in new leaders over the next decade so that in terms of race and ethnicity, the PUP's leadership and Price's cabinets began to look like the multi-ethnic nation of Belize. Fourth, the PUP and Price's approach to appealing to voters across race and ethnicity in all constituencies was one that Golson and the NIP eventually emulated to become electorally competitive at the national level. After 1973, the UDP, which followed the NIP, sought to mobilize more national support across all ethnic lines. Fifth, and not perhaps the least important, was the integrative leadership styles of Price and Golson themselves. Price was central to the early efforts of the PUP to implement its goal, quote, to achieve and preserve for the people of Belize national unity and political and economic independence, unquote. This national freedom and unity imperative translated into seeking support across geographic, gender, class, race, and ethnic lines. And this approach to winning became politically dominant. However, it is equally important to acknowledge that Philip Golson, who was so long in opposition, deserves credit for not pursuing an ethnic political approach to political power when hypothetically he easily could have. So the key point here is that by the last pre-independence election in 1979, a multi-ethnic political party strategy by both major political parties, both mass parties, the PUP and the UDP, a strategy was evolving into what is now a key feature of Belize's political culture. Now, how would this play out after independence? To that we now turn. We know by now that this aspect, this multi-ethnic political party strategy, this aspect of our political culture has survived since independence, even though it has been tested. Perhaps the biggest test has been demographic. The outmigration of Creoles, but especially the influx of Latinos from other Central American states in the 1980s and 1990s have resulted in proportional decreases in the Creole population alongside concurrent increases in the Mestizo population. And we all expect this trend to be further reflected in the current 2022 census. Such major demographic shifts have caused prolonged ethnic violence and even civil wars in other states. While Belize has avoided these, it has not all been smooth sailing, especially in the 1980s and first half of the 1990s, and especially around national amnesties. Apart from the usual scapegoating of the new and mostly poor Latino migrants, there were concurrent concerns that the Afro-Creole population was being marginalized. Politically, before the 1984 elections, the opposition UDP repeatedly criticized the People's United Party's government's refugee and immigration policies as being too liberal and aimed at Latinizing the electorate to its advantage. There was even some talk in some circles of a brewing ethnic war, as captured very well in this Buckdown cover of 1982. The PUP's government's first attempt at a policy response in 1984 was to agree with the dangers of the alien situation, as it called it, while at the same time implementing Belize's first amnesty before a border crackdown. Interestingly, one PUP minister, apparently also concerned about the influx from our Central American neighbors, floated the idea of bringing immigrants from Haiti. After the UDP won its first election in 1984, an immigration committee recommended importing Caribbean contract labor, but this was never acted upon. Overall, however, the UDP's immigration policies were in practice not that much different from the PUP's. And when in power, the UDP dispensed state programs and clientelist resources without overt discrimination of any ethnic group. The key reason why Belize emerged from these and later ethnic shifts and other challenges without a drift to ethnic-based political parties was that the political practice of both parties seeking votes across ethnic lines in all constituencies had solidified sufficiently by the 1980s. Importantly, the first UDP victory in 1984 saw it also win seats from geographical constituencies with majorities of every ethnic group, with Manuel Esquivel, a mestizo leader, at the helm. Then, as both parties traded turns in power, it was clear that neither the UDP or the PUP or the UDP, neither of them directly targeted one ethnic group over another. Such concerns almost evaporated in 2008, when the UDP swept 7 of 8 mestizo majority constituencies in the north. At the same time, Belize's first Creole prime minister was elected. Over time, the new Latino immigrants became targeted as potential voters and clients for both major political parties. Although it was the PUP that began to do this in the 1990s, the UDP promptly followed. Importantly, the new migrants have been targeted not because of their ethnicity as Latinos, but because of their voting appeal, just as all ethnic groups have been historically. Indeed, the lack of visible clientelist discrimination based on ethnicity, or at least the perception thereof, has itself contributed to the perpetuation of political parties that are integrated by ethnicity. Former Prime Minister Dean Barrow, who was in London on an official visit, gave an interview to Sky News in June 2013, and he pinpointed this aspect of our political culture. He noted how seamlessly Belize has managed tectonic demographic shifts. He went on to say, now the largest segment of the ethnic population would be Hispanic or mestizo. Notwithstanding that here it is that a Black person is able to be elected prime minister. So I think we have assimilated very well, and we are very proud of it, end of quote. John Briceño, our current prime minister, the first from a northern district, a mestizo district outside of Belize City, would likely express similar Belizean pride. Yet it is important that we do not mistake Belize's avoidance of ethnic-based political parties with the avoidance of all ethnic politics or ethnic tensions. Ethnicity plays a role in who is elected as candidates at a constituency level and in how cabinet posts and senior appointments are distributed. It facilitates the distribution of clientelist inducements, and rewards through existing ethnic networks. And each of the major ethnic groups now have ethnic councils that can lobby politically on their behalf. However, a political culture has evolved in which voters are not targeted by political parties based largely on ethnicity. A political culture has consolidated in which winning in the context of Belize's Westminster model is best ensured by appealing to all ethnic groups. As such, in terms of ethnicity, Belize has equal opportunity political parties and politicians across urban and rural communities, across gender, across migratory status. No party, no politician can be seen or perceived to be seen to give preference or to exclude one or other ethnic group. One downside of this is that Belize's political leaders have shied away from and tiptoed around important policy decisions related to key issues of immigration, population, language, for example, and yes, implementing customary land rights for the Maya. In conclusion, when or while the absence of ethnic-based party politics is clearly admirable and preferable, this has not done much to mitigate problems such as racism, persistent poverty, the deepening political tribalism, or entrenched political clientelism in Belize, which are all things that occur across all ethnic lines. Yet, if not exceptional, the Belize case is different in a unique way for a multi-ethnic developing state, at least in the Caribbean. The primary and encouraging lesson from the Belize case is that ethnic-based party politics in the context of Westminster is not the only outcome in small multi-ethnic societies. And yes, not everything in our heritage is worth preserving and celebrating, but this certainly is. Thank you.